Today, we're proud to interview a man who's not just a famous and recognized astrophotographer. He's an adventurer. At the end of Adam Block's interview, you'll probably understand why Indiana Jones introduces this video.
Well, can you tell us exactly when you started getting interested in astronomy and then astrophotography?
When I was my interest in astronomy began at a very early age. I don't actually remember a particular thing that got me interested. I've just always been interested, as far as I know. It may be that I walked with my grandfather in New England, and he, during these walks, maybe pointed out the sky or the moon or something along those lines. And I was just interested always. So I remember that my interest, I expressed that to my parents, and they bought a first telescope for me. These first telescopes, and this is something that happens to many kids, they tend to be more like a toy than something that you can really see a whole lot through. And at some sense, I view these first telescopes as kind of an initial true test of interest. Because if you can survive this stage of having a toy telescope and not really seeing very much, and still being interested, then the interest is genuine. And that's how it was for me. So later, my parents saw that my interest did not wane, and they bought a first telescope for me, which is it's a Richfield reflecting 4-inch telescope. It's called an Astroscan. It's shaped like a ball with a kind of a straight top, and it sits in a little rocker that you just place on the ground. And from that, I was able to first take views of the sky that really, showed me things in a reasonable way. It allowed me to point the telescope and see all kinds of things out there in the universe. So this is at the age of 8 or 9 years old. And then later, when I was 12 or 13, and this would have been, 35 years ago or something along those lines. I don't want to do the math. My uncle gave me a film camera. And so I attached that camera to the telescope and began to try to capture the things that I was seeing through the telescope. And that got me really excited. One of the interesting aspects to my interest in astronomy is that when I was growing up, my parents, they encouraged my interest, but they weren't necessarily interested in astronomy themselves, nor were my friends or anything. It wasn't a thing at the time. It was fairly unique to be interested in and have your own telescope and look at the sky, at least where I lived. So for me, it was important. I don't know if important, I just felt this urge to want to share my excitement, to want to really show people, hey, look, this thing is awesome. Come check it out. And so attaching a camera to a telescope allowed me to capture what I was seeing, and then I could share in another way. I didn't have to have the friend come over and look through the telescope. I could, maybe take a picture and show them the picture of things through the telescope.
What was your very first picture?
There are a couple of beginning pictures. One of them was, Polaris over the top of my house. This is later. So this is when I have this first telescope that I'm attaching the camera to. It was a Celestron 8-inch telescope. So that's what I got when I was, maybe 12 or 13 years old. And there was one place on my driveway, the only place I could be, otherwise I was in the lawn on the side of the hill or something, where I could just see over the top of the house Polaris, so I could align the telescope. So I remember one of my first pictures was just that, a picture of Polaris over the top of my house. I remember taking a wide field image. So my first images, I attached not the camera to the back of the telescope, but did the piggyback photography. And so I remember getting pictures of the Pleiades, the Hyades, and also taking a picture in the direction of the Andromeda Galaxy. And sure enough, if you look very closely, this is probably a 50 millimeter lens, you could see this little oval fuzz, and that got me very excited. Later, I went out to a dark site and took wide field images of Orion. And so that was really what I would say is my first image that I got very excited about. And the reason is because when I took that first picture of Orion, might have been a 5 or 10 minute exposure, and I got the picture back, not only could I see what I expected, which was the pink glow of the Orion Nebula, and I could see a little bit of the glow near Alnitak for where the Horsehead is and things like that. But then on my picture anyway, on the left side, I saw this red arc left of the belt, east of the belt. I went, what is that? So at the time, I didn't know, but I had Burnham's Celestial Guide, the book. So I look in the book, there it is. It's Bernard's Loop, and I have it right there. And so for me, that was fantastic, because now I could see, something that I didn't know about. And it wasn't at the time, wasn't well published in terms of what that thing was. Bernard's Loop, it's a supernova remnant. That's cool. Some star blew up, and I'm seeing that in my picture, star guts. So for me, that was really my first astrophotography, astrophoto that got me excited.
I think you graduated in astronomy and physics.
Yeah, in college, that's right.
Were you studying that, or were you planning on studying that before you looked into a telescope, or did you think of it after looking into a telescope?
My whole life, even before I looked through the it's just something I've always wanted to do. It's just always been astronomy for everyone. My experience in life has been different than other people. Many of my friends or people that I've met, at times where we were in school, they would say they didn't know what they wanted to do. Maybe they had multiple choices. For me, all of those multiple choices were only if the thing that I wanted to do, which should fail. I've always wanted to do the astronomy thing. It's just been a constant for me.
Did someone inspire you about that? I mean, I don't know, somebody like Carl Sagan or...
Later, when I was, older, I would look to a role model like Carl Sagan.
But you didn't look at the Cosmos TV show when you were a kid?
Yes.
Yeah, you saw that?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Enjoyed that a lot?
Yeah, that was fantastic. The funny thing, as a kid, I remember seeing the show, and I loved it, but I still couldn't take in some of the full dimension of what Carl Sagan certainly was trying to express, that later as an adult I could. But even as a kid, I could appreciate it was something something very special. And I went on to do exactly the Sagan-esque kind of thing, where I developed public outreach programs. And I literally stood in front of tens of thousands of people over the course of these programs, maybe hundreds of thousands, and delivered public outreach, delivered these presentations that were like what Carl Sagan would do. And so he was a big role model, someone that certainly I looked to, not only as an astronomer explaining things, but someone that was excited to explain things, someone that wanted to share their knowledge. And so that for me was certainly something that I took to.
When you started astrophotography, you said that you were one of the first to use CCD cameras, so the hobby was really moving forward at that time. Did you learn with someone, or did you have to learn on your own?
Yeah, so you're right. When I first started to use the CCD cameras, this was at a time that it just so happens that the National Observatory here in Arizona, it's the United States National Observatory, it's Kitt Peak National Observatory. They're just west of Tucson here. And just after I graduated from college, they decided that they wanted to expand the visitor center and start public outreach programs. And as I've indicated, sharing my excitement about astronomy is very important to me. So I figured, this has got to be probably a good first thing that I could get into. And I tried for that job. They actually hired me on the spot. And then I worked there for the next 9 years, developing the programs that still exist today there at the visitor center. And so I just serendipity. I just happened to have started those programs at a time when digital, CCD imagery was just starting to become a big thing in the amateur world. People getting and being able to buy cameras and doing this kind of astrophotography. And so I began right at that time. And so that really helped me to, really see so many different facets of the art and the science of astrophotography. But the thing is, there were no, certainly in the amateur community, there were no experts, there were no books written about the subject, there were no YouTube videos about what to do. So my experience is really an outlier in the sense that when I was doing this astrophotography, I decided to make an actual program out of it. The intent of the program would be to invite people to the observatory as part of this visitor center public outreach. And the experience that people have, not only could they look through the telescope in the beginning of the night as part of one of these programs, but then they could stay on the mountain. They could be treated as a visiting astronomer. And what does an astronomer do? Well, they don't look through telescopes with their eyes. Our eyes don't make very good detectors for doing scientific measurements. Instead, you put the sensors at the back of the telescope, these cameras. So just like the professionals, we would do the same on our visitor center telescope. So that was the beginning for me, was this astrophotography. And so I learned by trial and error. I learned with people actually beside me. This is a weird experience. So I didn't learn alone. I learned doing astrophotography with someone looking over my shoulder, thinking that I'm the expert at it, doing all of those trial and error, all of those mistakes. And I was, of course, very, again, fortunate because as part of my job, I would do it, almost nightly. And so in a few months or a handful of months, I could do in those months what might be years to many other amateur astronomers. And so I gained a lot of experience very quickly. I went through a lot of the mistakes, all of that trial and error stuff. It was just literally brute force was my way to learn astrophotography, but I really did do it at that time all on my own. There just really weren't any other resources for doing it.
When you started practicing astrophotography, did you feel like you were made for this hobby, or did you have to improve aspects of your maybe personality or knowledge to perform?
That's a tough one. My personality is such that I am not naturally inclined to interact with people. Certainly, it's very as part of these programs that I have done over the years, it's very intimate to actually spend an evening with somebody and doing this kind of experience of using a telescope all night long, or even just spending 5 hours with me as part of a public outreach program. So I'm not naturally someone that interacts with people, but I learned to, because my overriding thing about wanting to share, was somehow greater than my personality of not wanting to interact with people. So I don't know, it all worked out for me. But I certainly had a lot to learn in terms of literally dealing with people in a way, and it's part of these programs in a way that was, that worked out.
Yeah, okay, I get it. It's interesting because some people tell me that they have to understand what a sensor was, and that was not natural to them. They had to know how the camera would have to work, or they would have to plug wires and then understand the wires. They all told me that they needed to learn something that was technical. You're the only one who tells me that approximately what is technical doesn't seem to be a problem, but dealing with people is something maybe that
trickier.
had to take you out of your, I would say,
comfort zone.
Comfort zone. Yeah.
So but you're right. There's a technical side, but what usually the problem with the technical side usually ends up being, and this is true in almost every element of amateur astronomy and astrophotography, there needs to be a certain level of patience and willingness to try over and over to solve a problem, right? That can be very tiring and frustrating to some people. Now, what I did have in spades was the ability to continue to try to figure things out. So for me, the technical side, although I certainly didn't necessarily understand everything at a at an expert level of technicality, certainly when starting, but I did have the willingness to try over and over to see if I could make it work.
You've won an incredible amount of awards. I read somewhere that you had you've been nominated 90 times for NASA APOD, which is crazy. I mean, if we can reach one nomination, we'll be happy. When did you start to understand that maybe you were special as an astrophotographer?
Well, again, I wouldn't say that I'm special, but I would say that I have a lot of experience, and that's just coming from these programs that I did that incorporated astrophotography. And so it was special because it gave me an experience in that I have seen, problems. And so I can look at an image and I know what's going on with the telescope or the camera, or an understanding of the sky, literally. I could tell by the data that I was seeing, the conditions of whether the atmosphere was turbulent or some other thing that might be going on. I knew what I needed to do the astrophotography to make it work out. It's really an experiential thing that I think made what I was doing different than many other people's, the experiences that they might have, just because it's my job and I did it so often and so frequently, and I was interested in it. It wasn't, there are people that work in astronomy, but it's their job, and at the end of the day, they don't want to think about it. That's fine. But for me, I'm really excited about it.
And is it still your job? I mean, astronomy is still your job right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're very consistent.
Yeah. What do you do? You're a teacher at the university?
No, not. I would say I'm more of a researcher. I have my job right now is I work for another astronomer who studies very particular things about the sky and also its relationship actually to satellites. So that's one area of study. And then that I am also interested in this other thing, which is continuing to do the astrophotography on my own. One of the things that I do is I create instructional videos. So this is the other job that I have. And it is, again, just an outreach of that wanting to share my knowledge about what excites me about astronomy and astrophotography. So the instructional video thing is the other job that I have. So I work at the university doing this research, and I write programs and I operate a small telescope to do this particular work. And then on the other side, I'm also making these instructional videos and things like that.
And this is Adam Block Studios you're talking about, I think.
That's the website that does have the instructional content. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about it? I mean, what can we find here? How does it work? How much time does it take you?
Well, I don't know. So let's see. The Adam Block Studios is the place that I currently have all of my basically library, if you will, of instructional videos. And the thing that I'm highlighting today, although I've done, and this goes back to my experience, right? I have created instructional videos for all of these different software programs through time, because through time, there's this evolution of, which program is kind of the big thing at the time and so on. It used to be that my primary way of processing images was using a program called CCD Stack, which is a great program in its day. And then in the other half of the processing, you would use Photoshop. Together, those two programs would be what I used for more than a decade to produce the astrophotography that I was doing at the time. Then later, and this is getting up to today, software programs like PixInsight became available. And so I saw that this was a program that I thought was going to be the next kind of big thing, and it is. It has a huge toolbox and a big following today. And so now I highlight that particular program, PixInsight, as part of the latest videos that I'm producing on at Adam Block Studios. Boy, I have a lot. So basically, when you become a member of my site, you can basically purchase access to parts of that library. And I have hundreds of hours of instructional videos on PixInsight and more.
Would you give particular lessons to people, or not at all?
It's difficult for me right now to do one-on-one. I'm really trying to concentrate on creating these videos that I think are like a one-on-one experience. If you've ever watched one of my videos, they're not scripted. I don't write things down that I'm going to say. I do it as if you are with me. basically I spend time in this room talking to myself all the time. But I try to make those videos in a way that it is, that people can get as much information from them, probably even more, because I am more organized than if I were just to jump online with somebody and do a one-on-one session. I can do that, and I think I'm pretty good at that. But it's difficult for me to have the same reach than if I were to make a very nice video that really explains something well, and then have people, purchase access to those videos. I feel much better about that.
What is your favorite picture?
This is so one of the things that again, these are all these very fortunate things that happened in my life with astrophotography, is that when I started, this would have been in the mid 90s and in the early 2000s, just at the turn of the century, digital astrophotography was still new enough that you could take pictures of things regularly that there may not exist very nice pictures of, not in a reasonable resolution, high fidelity color picture. That's harder to do today. Today, lots of people have telescopes. They have telescopes in Chile. Astrophotography has evolved in such a way that it has greater access than it did when I, was doing this maybe 20 years ago. And so at the time, I always had a lot of fun taking pictures of things that they weren't in the book. They weren't on the web. You couldn't find another example of them because they didn't exist. And so for me, that was a real sense of exploration and discovery. And it was also a very good training ground for doing astrophotography because there were no references. There wasn't a picture I could look at and say, this is how it should look. Instead, when I had the data in my hand, I would do the processing with the principles that I understood of the art and science of astrophotography to render that picture. And so the pictures that I'm most proud of, are the ones where I had an opportunity to highlight some fantastic object that has not ever been taken, as well at that time before. And in particular, I remember taking a very nice picture of SH2 239. The molecular clouds that are in Taurus are just, it's like, it is just a playground of amazing things that aren't really like anything else in terms of emission nebulae. And a lot of emission nebulae are very similar, these glowing clouds of gas. But the clouds of dust and the way that they are illuminated and the way that they are sculpted in the molecular clouds in Taurus are just amazing. I took that picture at the time. There were just no pictures of it. And if you looked like at what was available at the time was the Digitized Sky Survey image of that piece of sky, you would have to really be bold to think that taking, several hours worth of time of exposure of this little piece of sky was even worth it. It didn't look like there was anything there. I mean, you could see a little fuzz, but you might just pass over it going for something else that was much bigger and brighter. But I was bold. I said, there might be something interesting there. And there really was. It's just a fantastic thing. So
what was your favorite movie about space, or maybe TV show, or don't you care at all about all this?
I have to mention the influence of Carl Sagan in this Cosmos series. I mean, that's very influential, but no, I don't recall there being anything in particular. I remember growing up more of the experience of, I grew up near Atlanta, Georgia. And in Atlanta, it has a very large planetarium that as an elementary school child, you would have the opportunity to visit. And I remember being placed in you would go into the planetarium and all the seating, and then they would bring down the lights and you would see the stars projected onto the dome. And it was really remarkable, especially because growing up as a kid, I didn't have access to the dark skies, being relatively close to Atlanta. I never really saw the stars. It was only until I came out here to college in Arizona that I finally saw what the universe looked like. I didn't know. I had never seen the Milky Way, not really until I had come all the way out here. I could see it dimly, but the summer Milky Way, for example, when I first saw it here in Arizona, I jumped up and down for at least 10 minutes, pointed at the sky saying, oh my God, it's real. This is amazing. So the planetarium for me, I think, was, as a child, even more had more impact than, say, a movie which might show space or something like that. That seemed to be, to me, a better window into what really captured my attention.
How do you look at the kind of golden age of astrophotography we're living right now? I mean,
so when I began using equipment that really wasn't designed to do astrophotography. This is, again, back in the mid 90s, at the visitor center of Kitt Peak, the observatory. I was using an LX200, a Meade LX200, to do astrophotography. It is not meant to do that. And I was using a camera at the time that, by today's standards, would basically be considered blind. So the sensors at the time, I was using, I think, an SBIG ST6 or 7. That's the chip that I began with. And the sensitivity, for example, if you were to try to take a color picture, which was a new thing, right? There was the grayscale images, and then you wanted to try to put together a color picture. In blue, these sensors, their blue sensitivity just dropped like a rock. Your exposure times to get the right ratio to make a color balanced image, you might expose for some period of time in red, a little bit longer in green. Blue, you would expose for infinity. I mean, you would just there was no exposure long enough to get enough blue information. So it wasn't a noisy image. So I would always remember what that was like. So today, it's much better with these sensors and the telescopes that are designed to be precise enough to have the tolerance necessary to do the astrophotography. That just wasn't the case in the very beginning. Here's how I see it evolving. I think that the next big thing is going to be, with the lack of access that people have. I think access will probably start to be in the public domain of data that comes from telescopes that are well placed. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Rubin Observatory, LSST. So that's going to produce, almost an astronomical amount of data that no one individual could ever digest. So it's going to be basically data that people, I suspect, will eventually be able to download and investigate. These are pictures taken with what is, for all intents and purposes, an 8-meter telescope from Chile, under the best possible place on Earth. I think that might become one of the new ways of doing astrophotography, is to get these kinds of data sets, because you won't be able to do that with your own equipment, right? You'll be able to add, because the LSST, the Rubin Observatory, is going to take pictures of the night sky over and over and over a year, and over the years, you'll be able to basically put together very long exposures and deep exposures of the sky in a way that would just not be possible with your own equipment. So that might be a new evolution in the way astrophotography is done. It's through the public science of it, the public available data. I don't know, that might be a new evolution, different than going out to your own telescope at the dark side. I don't think that'll go away.
I hope so. I hope it doesn't.
Yeah, of course. I'm not saying that's going to go away, but in terms, you want evolution in the sense of change, I see that as a possible change. I also see, and just to be clear, this could be the sad note, I also see that, all the astrophotography that I've done over, the decades, that could easily be replaced within a few years of what a telescope like this is designed to do. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when that comes online.
3 questions. One of my friends, who is one of the French specialists of PixInsight, wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
He wondered if you saw any kind of processing difference between the countries. I mean, we feel sometimes that American astrophotographers, they tend to push the saturation a little bit. As in France, we prefer to keep the colors maybe softer. Do you have any vision of that, or not at all? I mean,
here's what I would say. I'm obviously in the circle of many astrophotographers, and I hear your sense of that, but I can name a few French astrophotographers who have a very colorful rendering style. I think that what you're probably seeing is numbers. I suspect that there are just more, American, North America kind of numbers of astrophotographers than there might be just French. I think if you had a larger community of French, it's just sheer number of people, you're going to start to see more of that distribution of style or choice in processing.
So I don't believe it's cultural in any way.
I don't know. I think that's harder to say than something else. And just to highlight this point, I wrote an essay on something else that I think is related, which is the other end, because you asked, are there cultural influences? And what interested me are the ones that are cross-culturally shared. Mm-hmm. In other words, what makes an image compelling to everyone, no matter what your culture is? That is what interested me. And so I wrote an essay on that. And one of the things that inspired that essay was a philosopher named Dennis Dutton, who wrote and had a TED Talk on this idea of what beauty is from an evolutionary standpoint. An evolutionary one that is cross-culturally shared. That is, what ancient echoes do we carry with us when we think of something as beautiful? And that, I think, can be applied to astrophotography. There are elements of an image that almost everyone wants or agrees on. Why is it that everyone wants to potentially increase the contrast or raise that color saturation, or shrink their stars, or things like that? Those elements of an image, many of them are shared by just about everyone in the world. And so I wrote an essay about that, and it's inspired from this Dennis Dutton kind of theory of beauty.
Is there a way to read this essay? I mean, is it available on the internet, or is it? I
haven't published it. I've shared it with a lot of people, but I haven't published it. I'd be happy to share it with you. I have spoken about it. There's a talk that I gave at the Center for Creative Photography here at the University of Arizona, where I hinted at it. I also spoke in Austria for CEDEC, for the Central European, basically astrophotography conference. And I spoke on this subject as well for that talk. So it's something that I've spoken about, but I haven't really published because I still think it's not something that people think about deeply.
No, it's an interesting point,
because of my experience, I do think about it deeply. For example, you mentioned that I've had a lot of astronomy pictures of the day, and pictures have been published. Some of that has to do with the decisions that I make in terms of, rendering images, but it's not only understanding what other people might perceive, it's also an understanding of the goals that I might want to reach. So there's this combination of what I want to communicate and what I know other people are likely to see or feel or whatever it is. So all of that is together in my thoughts when I try to produce an image.
No, it's really interesting because you kind of anticipated the third questions you wanted to ask you. It was wondering if you had a mathematic approach on your processing, or also an aesthetical approach on processing.
The way that I approach astrophotography is that I have a vision basically in my mind for what the image it is that, by looking at the data, I want to highlight, I want to bring out. Basically, I want to keep, it's so easy, of course, when you're processing an image to to muddy or destroy or whatever it is, the cool thing that you first saw in that initial data, and you know you wanted to end up in the final result, you know, not so much noise and everything else. So one of the things that I found in workshops is that the one question people ask me is, how do you know what to do next? Yes, I know how to do all the calibration and all that. They want to know what to do next. And my answer is to really look at the data and what makes you excited about what you're seeing in front of you. That's how you know what to do next, because using your knowledge of astrophotography, using your knowledge of the software to process the data is what's going to help you get to what you want to potentially do. So whether it is that technical mathematical thing, if that is what's necessary for me, I want to understand that in order to reach that goal. Or it may be that it's just literally the feedback of using some sliders or something like that. It doesn't matter to me. I want to be able to understand both ways of interacting with the data to reach that. This would be the Ansel Adams pre-visualization idea, but it's this idea that I have this raw data and I know where I want to get to if I can do everything I want with the data, assuming the information is there. And so I'll use any of those tools. Pixel math is just one way. And if that's the easiest way, then certainly I'll use that as a tool. But I view these only as a way to get to where I want to be. So software is just my it's my hammer, it's my chisel, it's the thing that allows me to do the art. But I don't think about, whether the chisel requires an understanding of programming or math or anything else. That's just part of the tool. Then I'm going to take advantage of it.
You were talking about the people you were in touch with around the world, which is one of the cool aspects of practicing astrophotography and having the social networks now.
Yeah.
Are there astrophotographers I wouldn't say admire, but whose work you find is inspiring or very interesting? Or
I think one of the things that I look at when I look at other people's work is even if I don't necessarily share their style, some people have a consistency in the way in which they make decisions. And that consistency might be that, the image itself, everything about the image makes sense. It might not be my style, but within the decision space that they used, because they wanted a certain level of contrast or color saturation or brightness or whatever it is, whatever those decisions were, I can see their choices in that work, and it all hangs together. It all works together. There are, I would say that sometimes those that are beginning in astrophotography, you can see the choices that they made, but they are somehow discordant because they don't hang together. You can see that they process the stars in one way, and they're trying to get the details of the galaxy or the nebula in another way. And the whole thing, it kind of works. I mean, those individual decisions are fine, but it doesn't go together. So astrophotographers that I admire that have that kind of more uniform decision world and way in which they approach rendering and producing these pictures. I've always been impressed with. Rob Gendler is an imager that I started with. He was producing images at the same time I was way back when, and other imagers that you probably haven't, they haven't been around in a while. There's a guy who's Bill McLaughlin. I mean, this guy used to make his choices in color and the way that he produced his images at the time were fantastic. He would be on the cover of Astronomy Magazine and Sky and Telescope. But today, imagers such as Russ Croman and many of the other people that I know that visit, like the Advanced Imaging Conference in San Jose, those are imagers that again have that consistency of style and choice that just looks really, really good when you look at those.
is there a picture that you dream of?
Dream of.
Yeah, that you would like to take, or maybe because it's something that you do not imagine yet. But is there? Have you photographed everything in the sky that you wanted to photograph,
No,
or are there
no.
things that you haven't had the chance to do, maybe because it's not in the right hemisphere, or maybe once again a planetary nebula that nobody has ever
Yeah,
photographed?
I still search those out, to be honest. I search out those things that I think are underappreciated, that sometimes people just wouldn't spend the time to image. I of course enjoy the big bright things, but there are lots of things that are the smaller, less obvious, but still contain some really interesting element to them. And I always seek those things out. So there isn't anything in particular. I'm up for anything. The famous stuff, the faint stuff. I'm an omnivore when it comes to the astrophotography. I'll do it all. But I do especially enjoy highlighting those things that there might not be a really nice picture of. And recently, for example, I spent a lot of time. I have to go look at the number again. I can't remember the number right now. NGC 38, whatever. Um, well, 3898 was one, but there's another very tight southern spiral galaxy. And it's only like, I don't even know if it was 2 arc minutes across, but it was a beautiful spiral. And because I had some access to a telescope in Chile, the data was very good, which means you could kind of zoom in on it a little bit, present that image in a reasonable scale. And that made me really happy because there just aren't any nice pictures of that particular galaxy. So I liked it.
Do you remember one particular awful night of astrophotography?
First one I want to tell you about is the one where now this is me with that 8-inch telescope and a film camera. And of course, you put the camera on, you take all these pictures, you take hours, you advance the film. Now, on the old cameras, you can advance it, you can advance the little lever, and it seems as though it's advancing the film. But hours later, when you bring the camera inside and you are supposedly, putting the film back into the canister, and then you open up the back of the camera and there's no film in there. You've just exposed on plastic or the back of your camera with no film for the past 2 hours. That's you have that experience once, and then you don't do that again. And then you just learn very quickly how every detail really, really matters. The other one is kind of funny. When I worked at Kitt Peak, working with this LX200 to do astrophotography was difficult. But on this one night, there's always some problem with this thing. So on one night, I'm moving the telescope around, attaching the camera, and I hear these noises in the observatory, right? I hear these noises and they're somewhere near my feet. So I hear noise in the telescope, and it sounds like the telescope it has this metal arm structure, this fork arm. And I hear this noise in the metal, and then I hear things falling at my feet. And I couldn't put the two together. And so I got out my flashlight and I'm looking around on the floor and I'm trying to figure out what the noise was. I thought literal parts of the telescope were falling out onto the floor. But all I could see on the floor were acorns. And at first, this struck me as funny because I'm looking for metal parts, right? I'm looking for something that's falling apart with this telescope. But it turns out that, it finally comes to me that those acorns are what was falling out of the telescope. Of course, I'm in the observatory. Where are the acorns coming from? Well, they're coming from an oak tree that's just not that far away from the observatory. And a mouse had started to store little acorns in the arms of the fork arm of the telescope. And so when I started to move the telescope, all of his cache of acorns was falling onto the floor. Now, the funny thing is that I was cleaning out the acorns and I'm pulling it out of the arms of the telescope. But I swear not, but 5 minutes later, the mouse comes up the column, the pier of the telescope, and he sits on the floor and he literally looks at me for a moment before it runs away. And I think he was like complaining that I had taken his acorns, and he was upset about it.
What piece of advice would you give to someone who would come and see you and say, I want to start astrophotography? If you had to give him 2 or 3 advices, what would they be?
I think the number one thing for astrophotography is it's this idea of patience and enjoying problem solving. You know, I think that this is especially true today, where there is an expectation that when you buy a piece of equipment or you see someone else's work, that things will, because you've set it up or because you have the right equipment, that kind of engenders this expectation that it's going to work out. And unfortunately, there are just so many variables that in principle it could, but it doesn't necessarily, mean that everything is going to come together. It could be everything from natural stuff, the weather, to the equipment itself, to just a level of experience and understanding. So I would say that the combination of patience and wanting to solve problems, literally, you have to want to, to figure it out. If you don't want to figure it out, that's tough. If you're going to want to also enjoy it, you have to want to enjoy figuring it out, because once you've figured it out, then the enjoyment of what you've produced or what you've done is multiplied. If it all literally just worked out in the beginning, I mean, it's great, but there is a sense of accomplishment, obviously, when you figure out a problem. And the thing about astrophotography, there are just always problems. And this is true at the professional level as well. If you go to a professional observatory and you see the work that they're doing, they are always having problems. You might think, well, why don't, this is a professional observatory. Why isn't everything just working, 100% perfectly? And it just never does. So it's a hard thing to do. There's not a lot of light. The instruments are very persnickety, and so it's tough. Yeah. Problem solving and patience.
When you are having trouble with your rig, remember Adam had to solve everything alone. Knowing that, would you dare to say he is not an adventurer?